The Dacians, the erased ancestors of Romania. There are places in the world where time does not march, where it drifts, like smoke through pines, curling into the folds of mountains and valleys, carrying stories too old for words and too quiet for history books. One such place lies nestled beneath the shadows of the Carpathians, where the land rises and falls like a sleeping colossus and the rivers murmur in a tongue few remember. This is where the Dacians once lived. Not far from where today's Romania breathes with modern life, there once stood a civilization of warriors, artisans, dreamers, and priests who carved their beliefs into stone and bled their defiance into the soil. They built fortresses not to conquer distant lands, but to hold fast to their own. They watched the stars not for conquest, but for meaning. Their gods lived in the mountains, and their kings walked among wolves and oracles. Yet today, few speak their name. Their language is gone. Their temples are dust. Their people, absorbed into the empires that crushed them, have become shadows among shadows. But the stones still whisper, the forests still guard, and the wind still carries fragments of a people who stood on the edge of history and disappeared into its depths. This is not a tale of conquest alone, nor of tragedy, though there is blood and sorrow in what is to come. This is the quiet resurrection of memory, a journey not only through time, but through silence, through all that remains unspoken. As you listen, let the noise of the present slip away. Let the noise of empires fade. Beneath the layers of Latin and Slavic and modern machinery, there is an older heartbeat, a fainter rhythm, a people who once dared to defy the most powerful empire the world had known. Their voices may be lost, but their presence remains, pressed into the earth, waiting to be unearthed again. This is the story of the Dacians, the erased ancestors, the quiet kings of the mountains. Let us begin where the mist first met the fire. Chapter 1. In the time before borders, when the mountains were the law. Long before maps were carved into parchment and borders etched in blood, there was only land, endless, breathing, unbroken land. And in that land, long before it bore the name Romania, the mountains ruled. The Carpathians curled like a vast stone serpent across the heart of the ancient world, guarding the valleys and guarding the sky. It was here, among the firs and birches, under the wheeling constellations of forgotten gods, that the Dacians were born, not as a nation, but as a people of the land. They did not rise in the burst of a single moment, like empires often do, but slowly, shaped by wind and river, storm and fire. Their beginnings were like the roots of the trees that surrounded them, deep, hidden, entwined with older peoples whose names have vanished like smoke. What we now call the Dacians were once tribes without a single name, bound by similar beliefs, rituals, and fears, whispering to the same gods carved in stone and weather. The land gave them everything and asked everything in return. They grew wheat in the soft soils of the lowlands and hunted stag in the silence of the northern woods. They mined gold from the Apusini mountains and salt from the earth itself, trading these for what they could not make. Yet they were never merchants by heart. What they built was not for wealth, but for endurance. Their fortresses were not cities in the Roman sense, but sacred spaces, half shrine, half citadel, balanced on ridges and cliffs as if placed by the wind itself. They lived not in sprawling towns, but in scattered villages, each tied more to its landscape than to any king. And yet, even then, there was a thread, a shared breath, a growing awareness that they were not merely isolated clans, but part of something larger, deeper. Perhaps it was the mountain that taught them unity, or perhaps it was the growing pressure of foreign eyes that watched from across the Danube. By the first millennium BCE, the Dacians were beginning to emerge as a recognizable people. Greek chroniclers began to speak of them, though always with the distance of the outsider, as fierce, untamed, lovers of wine and war. Some called them Thracians, others Geti. But names, in those times, were always a matter of perspective. What mattered was not what the outside called them, but how they saw themselves. And in this, the Dacians were not mere warriors. They were mystics, keepers of the boundary between the seen and the unseen. Their shamans, known later as kapnobatai, or those who walk in smoke, would retreat into caves and forests to commune with forces the Romans could never understand. To the Dacians, The veil between worlds was thin, and those who dared to seek could speak with gods, ancestors, and stars. Death was not the end, but a doorway. Fear, not a burden, but a companion. It was this that gave them their strength. And perhaps, too, their doom. For empires cannot tolerate a people who do not fear death. Their warriors painted their bodies and fought with curved falxes that could shear through both shield and bone. They wore tattoos not to intimidate, but to mark the stories of their lives. When they sang before battle, it was not to taunt the enemy, but to honor the land that would soon take them back. And when they died, they did so with open eyes, for they believed they would return. The soul, to them, was not a fragile thing, but a flame carried by wind from one world to the next. Yet the world was changing. Across the seas, Rome was rising. The legions marched, carrying roads, laws, and the cold precision of empire. And though the Dacians remained sheltered in their mountains, the tremors could be felt in the roots of the earth. Traders brought Roman coins and Roman gossip. Outposts appeared along the Danube like silent sentinels. And though the Dacians held fast to their rituals and their stars, the balance was beginning to tilt. But in this early chapter, before the blood, before the conquest, there was still quiet. There was still the forest at dawn, the call of the deer, the flicker of firelight on stone. The Dacians still believed in their gods, still believed in their kings, still believed that the mountains would protect them, as they always had. And for a time, they were right. The Carpathians held the world at bay, and the people of the wind and rock lived as they always had, rooted not in empire, but in silence. In the Dacian world, the mountain was not merely a place of stone, it was a mind, a spirit, an ancient witness. It did not shout. It listened. It did not move. It endured. Among its cliffs and forests, the Dacians found their gods not in temples of marble, but in the breathing wind, the echoing caves, the slow whisper of pine needles falling in sacred groves. The Dacians did not look outward to find meaning. They looked inward and upward, into the ridges, the fog, and the flickering of firelight on ancient walls of rock. At the heart of their belief stood the figure of the priest, neither ruler nor servant, but a bridge between what is and what lies beyond. These men, drawn from the depths of the people, climbed into solitude to listen, not with their ears, but with their bones. The Romans, puzzled by their practices, described them as inhalers of smoke, capnobatai, those who walked in the haze between vision and trance. They would fast, burn sacred herbs, and withdraw into stillness, waiting for the voice that was not a voice to come. And at the center of it all, hidden in the folds of the Oresti Mountains, stood a place the Dacians called sacred above all others, Sarmizegetusa Regia. Not merely a capital, not merely a stronghold, but a cosmic hinge, where earth met sky and men met the divine. Here, in silence more powerful than drums, they laid out stone circles in precise alignment with the solstices. They watched the heavens, not as a curiosity, but as a language. To them, time did not move forward, it moved in circles. It returned, and so must the soul. They carved altars not for sacrifice, but for dialogue. They did not believe they could control their gods, only listen. When thunder echoed through the ridges, it was not merely weather, it was a reply. When the wolves howled, the Dacians paused their steps. The animals of the forest were not lesser. They were closer to the veil, unburdened by the noise of thought. The Dacians revered them not with fear, but with a solemn respect. Among their deities, one name flickers through the Roman accounts like a fading spark, Zalmoxis. To the Greeks and Romans, he was a god, a prophet, or a former slave turned mystic, depending on who spoke. But to the Dacians, he was something more elusive. Some believed he once walked among them, a teacher of the afterlife, who vanished into the earth only to rise again. Others spoke of him as the eternal presence behind all life, a soul that never sleeps. He asked not for temples, but for remembrance. He offered not reward, but release. This belief in the soul's journey beyond death, in return, in reunion with the great flame of being, made the Dacians formidable in the eyes of Rome. For what empire can conquer a people who do not fear dying, who walk into battle with songs, not because they are fearless, but because they understand that to fall is not to vanish. To the Romans, who prized law and order, the Dacians were unpredictable, unreachable. They lived in mountains, dreamed in fire, and spoke in a language no sword could silence. Their rituals were never written, their language never preserved in script. Yet through the rhythm of stone placements, through the circular sanctuaries aligned to the stars, a pattern remains, a soft fingerprint in the soil. What the Romans could not read, they dismissed. What they could not copy, they destroyed. But even empire cannot erase a people entirely when their memory is buried not in books, but in earth and cloud and echo. On moonless nights, the priests would gather in sacred places, lighting fires and sitting in silence for hours, waiting for the pulse of the world to emerge. These rituals were not for spectacle. They were slow, quiet, internal, and from them, visions came, not of conquest, but of meaning. The Dacians believed that through stillness, the soul could be reminded of its origin, that through ritual, one could speak to Zalmoxis, not in words, but in silence. And so the foundation of the Dacian people was not built upon armies, though they would one day raise them. It was not built on wealth, though they mined more gold than many empires. It was built upon a flame that burned quietly, deep within each person, a reverence for the unseen, the eternal, the interconnected. Theirs was not a civilization of expansion. It was a civilization of depth, of listening, of knowing that the mountain does not rush, that truth does not shout, that meaning waits in the still places. Before the legions came, before the blood soaked the stones of Sarmizegetusa, there was this, a people with no written language who mapped the heavens with perfect precision, a people feared by Rome not for their cruelty, but for their calm, and above all, a people who understood that what cannot be spoken may still be remembered. The Dacians lit their fires in silence, and in that silence, their story still smolders. In the highlands of Dacia, where fog weaves through pine branches and the rivers run cold over stone, there lies a treasure that once gleamed not only beneath the soil, but in the stories whispered through generations. Gold, soft, incorruptible, eternal, was more than a metal to the Dacians. It was a light that pulsed beneath their mountains, a blood that flowed in silence, untouched for centuries until the rest of the world began to take notice. The Apusini Mountains, folded into the heart of what is now western Romania, bore this gift in great abundance. Nuggets glittered in stream beds, veins ran thick through the rocks, and dust settled into the creases of miners' hands. The Dacians did not worship gold, but they understood its weight. They forged it into bracelets coiled like serpents, into discs worn close to the heart, into sacred offerings buried deep beneath their sanctuaries. The gold bore symbols, spirals, wolves, suns, etched with patience and meaning, each stroke like a breath held in time. To outsiders, it was wealth. To the Dacians, it was memory made solid. Gold was used not as coin, but as message, a way to communicate with the unseen. When they buried gold, it was not hidden, it was given, to gods, to ancestors, to the land itself. Their minds were not sprawling industrial wounds upon the earth, but quiet openings, carefully chosen. Their tools, simple. Their presence underground, reverent. In the dark, where silence hung heavy, the Dacians moved with ritual, not greed. But wealth never hides for long. And as the Dacians adorned themselves in gold shaped not for vanity, but for story, word began to spread beyond the mountains. Traders brought whispers to the cities of the south, tales of barbarian kings weighed down by treasures that glowed in the sun. Roman merchants brought home trinkets and questions. The empire, always listening, always hungering, began to look northward. To Rome, gold was not sacred. It was control. It bought legions, built cities, sustained gods carved from cold stone. And in the time of Augustus, when the empire was freshly wrapped in laurels and ambition, reports of Dacia's hidden gold took root like seeds in imperial soil. Still, Rome waited. The Dacians were fierce, the terrain unforgiving. And so, for a while, the golden silence remained unbroken. Within Dacia itself, power began to crystallize. Though still composed of tribes, each with its own chieftains and customs, a greater unity was forming, bound not by domination, but by necessity. At the heart of this slow weaving was the priesthood, and beside it, a rising line of kings. Leaders began to emerge who did not merely protect their clan, but dreamt of a Dacia that could endure against the outside world. Among these, names began to echo: Burbista, Dacians, and, later, Decebalus. Burbista, in particular, would come to reshape the land. In the 1st century BCE, he united the fractured tribes through both wisdom and flame, wielding the influence of the priest Dacians to bring spiritual cohesion alongside military strength. Under his rule, the sacred and the strategic became one. He banned wine to sharpen the minds of his people. He restructured fortresses and sent messages to far-off lands. For a moment, it seemed Dacia might rise as more than a mystery on the edge of the empire. But the empire was never idle. Though Rome did not strike immediately, its gaze deepened. Spies and merchants mapped the mountain passes. Alliances were tested, and in time, Burbista's kingdom would fragment once more, undone not by invasion, but by the pressures of its own breath. The mountains that protected the Dacians also divided them, and gold, once a symbol of inner light, began to draw the outer world ever closer. The Dacians knew this. Their kings were not naive. They saw what Rome had done to Gaul, to Carthage, to Egypt. They understood the cost of resisting and the cost of surrender. But they were not ready to bow. Instead, they watched the rivers, listened to the forests, and prepared. In the sacred hills of Sarmizegetusa, gold continued to flow, not as wealth, but as warning. The offerings grew larger, the prayers quieter. And always, the silence of the mountain waited. The Dacians stood at the edge of an age. Their gold, their unity, their belief, it all shimmered like a reflection on moving water. Beautiful, fragile, temporary. The time of encounter was coming. Of legion and falx, of gods in conflict, of languages spoken in dust and flame. But before that, there was this final gleam, a land of gold untouched, a people unbroken, a silence unpierced. The mountain still watched, and so did Rome. There are names that arrive in history like whispers, carried slowly through time, and others that crash like thunder, leaving scars in the stones. Among the Dacians, the name Decebalus came like the quiet before a storm, a man shaped not only by power, but by the burden of what was coming. He did not inherit peace. He inherited a land shadowed by empire, a people surrounded by hunger, and a silence that could no longer hold. Born into a time of fracture, Decebalus, whose name meant the brave one of the Dacians, did not rise through sheer bloodline or wealth. He rose because the mountain needed a voice, because the valleys, long protected by ritual and resolve, were no longer beyond reach. The Roman Empire had grown bold. The Danube, once a border of water and wilderness, had become a line drawn in fire, and across that river, emperors stirred. Decebalus was both warrior and visionary, forged by the teachings of his forebears and the fury of his age. He knew the old ways, the stars, the flame, the speech of stone, but he also understood the new language of survival: diplomacy, strategy, deception. He could speak with priests in the mountain sanctuaries and with generals at the gates of battle. He did not seek to conquer the world. He sought to protect a world that had never needed walls until now. In the early years of his rule, the Dacians found new strength. Decebalus rebuilt fortresses, deepened alliances among tribes once divided, and restored the sacred order that had begun to fray after Burbista's fall. Sarmizegetusa Regia became more than a spiritual center. It became a citadel, a statement, a promise. The circular sanctuaries were joined by stone walls and towers, and the forests around them were filled with watchmen, scouts, and quiet preparations. But even as Dacia rallied, Rome was watching. Across the Danube, the empire tested and tightened its grasp. In 85 CE, a Roman commander crossed into Dacian lands, burning villages and leaving ashes in his wake. The Dacians, fierce and fast, struck back, and the Roman general, Appius Sabinus, was killed. This was not just a wound. It was a challenge, and challenges to Rome demanded reply. The Emperor Domitian sent legions northward. The Dacians met them in terrain they knew like breath. In ravines and wooded passes, they struck, vanished, and struck again. Roman discipline faltered against mountain ghosts. Though outnumbered and underarmed, the Dacians broke through imperial lines and sent panic back across the Danube. It was a war of spirit as much as steel, and for a time, the Dacians won. Rome, humiliated, agreed to terms. An uneasy peace settled over the ridges. Domitian, desperate to save face, agreed to pay annual tribute. Gold sent southward in caravans, flowing from the sacred mines of Dacia into the veins of Rome. But to Decebalus, this was no submission. It was delay. It was breath. He used the time to build, to gather engineers, fortify ridges, train warriors. He invited Roman defectors to teach the arts of siege and defense. The mountain people were preparing, not resting. Still, for a few quiet years, there was calm. Fires burned gently in hilltop shrines. Festivals returned to the valleys. The gold flowed, yes, but so did prayer and belief and memory. The old songs were sung again, not as mourning, but as invocation. Children were born who did not yet know the taste of empire. The wolves returned to the forests. The snow fell gently on the roofs of mountain dwellings. Yet deep within Decebalus, and among the priests who watched the stars, there was no illusion. Rome forgets nothing. Peace with Rome is not peace, it is pause. And already, in the south, new ambitions were rising. A new emperor was watching, one with the eyes of a soldier and the will of iron. Trajan. His time would come. But for now, Decebalus waited. He walked among his people with calm strength, spoke in few words, and listened to the trees. In this final breath before the storm, Dacia was whole. Its king walked in both shadow and light. Its people sharpened tools beneath the stars. And the mountains, timeless and unchanged, held the silence with the patience only stone can know. The wind carried no warnings, only the echo of a name that would soon shake the empire itself. Decebalus, the last great mountain king. The river had long been a promise, a silver line that separated the restless south from the sacred north. To the Dacians, the Danube was not only a barrier of water, but a living boundary, drawn by the gods to hold the world at balance. For generations, it had divided empire from wilderness, law from breath, control from spirit. But rivers are only strong while they are respected, and Rome no longer waited. In the year 101 CE, under the newly risen Emperor Trajan, the silence was broken. The empire, vast and scarred from its wars of expansion, now turned its full gaze toward Dacia, not for pride alone, but for necessity. The gold, the grain, the position, it was too much for Rome to ignore. And so began the First Dacian War, not with fanfare, but with footsteps. Legion after legion marched north, steel glinting beneath foreign skies. Trajan himself led them. This was no punitive raid. This was conquest. Across the Danube, Rome built a bridge, not of wood or rope, but of stone and ambition. A marvel of engineering stretched across the current, strong, wide, imperial. It was more than a crossing. It was a statement. Rome had come not to negotiate, but to stay. The Dacians watched. From cliffs and tree lines, they saw the horizon fill with armor, the forests echo with orders in a language they did not speak. The time of preparation was over. Decebalus, calm and unshaken, gathered his people. There were no grand speeches. There was only movement, swift and purposeful. Warriors poured into the mountain passes. Fortresses were reinforced. Smoke rose in spirals from signal fires. But this war would not be like the last. Trajan was different. He had studied their ways, their terrain, their tactics. And he brought not just soldiers, but siege engines, engineers, and patience. Rome had come to unmake a world. The first clashes were fierce and fast. Dacian warriors, wielding their curved falxes, struck with the fury of the earth itself. They did not line up as Romans did. They emerged from trees, from fog, from sudden silence. But the Romans absorbed the chaos. They built roads as they marched. They cut through forest and rock. And when they took a fortress, they left nothing behind but ash and flags. Slowly, methodically, Rome crept into the heart of Dacia. Sarmizegetusa, the sacred capital, stood like a dream in stone, still untouched, still watching. But around it, the outer strongholds began to fall. And with each loss, the Dacians grew quieter, not weaker. They withdrew inward, not out of fear, but clarity. They had seen empires before. They knew the cost of standing still. So they moved like the rivers, never staying in one place long enough to be captured. But still, the pressure grew. The priests lit fires in the inner sanctuaries. The people whispered old prayers, not for victory, but for memory. The gold was hidden. Children were sent into deeper forests. And Decebalus moved through his kingdom like a shadow, appearing where least expected, always watching, always listening. He had no illusions. He was not fighting to expand. He was fighting to remain. By the end of the campaign, the mountains were scorched. The land bore wounds that would take generations to forget. But still, Sarmizegetusa stood. Rome, bloodied and exhausted, accepted a truce. Decebalus, ever the strategist, agreed. Dacia was not yet conquered, but it had been shaken. And Trajan, though momentarily still, was not done. The river had been crossed. The sky had changed. And the silence that once held the mountains was beginning to splinter. For a time, both sides retreated. Rome licked its wounds. Dacia gathered its breath. But something had shifted, irreversibly. The old ways, though alive, now walked with ghosts. The fires still burned in the sanctuaries, but the wind carried a new sound, the distant, rhythmic tread of Roman order. It did not rush. It did not roar. It simply marched. And Decebalus, standing in the stone circles of his ancestors, knew that the final war had not yet begun. What had come was only the first shadow. The storm was still forming. High in the Oresti Mountains, surrounded by thick forest and folds of mist, lay a place unlike any other in the Roman world. It was not grand in the way Rome understood grandeur. There were no marble columns, no sweeping avenues, no statues cast in imitation of gods. And yet Sarmizegetusa Regia pulsed with something deeper. It was the breath of a civilization that had grown with the land rather than upon it. The Dacians did not carve the mountain. They listened to it. And in the listening, they built their soul. Sarmizegetusa Regia was not just a fortress. It was a sanctuary. It stood on a ridge not because it was defensible, though it was, but because it was sacred. The stars above it, the rivers below, the shape of the land itself had been read like scripture. Within its walls, soldiers and priests walked side by side, and neither outranked the other. One guarded the body, the other the breath. The citadel was stone and silence, geometry and reverence, a place where knowledge was not hoarded but embodied. At its center stood a series of concentric circles, laid out with precise astronomical knowledge, aligned with solstices and lunar rhythms. These were not decorative. They were instruments, tools to mark the passage of time, to track the heavens, to honor the great cycles. When a Dacian priest stood in the center of the sanctuary, he stood between earth and cosmos, between the soil of ancestors and the eternal wheel of sky. There were wooden temples, built without nails, their beams fitted with reverence and skill. There were altars of limestone and sandstone, covered in carved symbols, spirals, suns, wolves, trees of life. Beneath some of these, offerings had been placed. Gold, bone, incense, shaped objects meant to travel beyond the veil. Sarmizegetusa was a conversation with the unseen, carried out over generations, in ritual and architecture. It did not shout its power. It breathed it. From this place, Decebalus ruled. He did not sit on a gilded throne. He walked the terraces. He met with tribal leaders beneath open sky. His court was not one of luxury, but of knowledge and presence. Roman spies, when they came, were confounded. There were no sprawling palaces, no great hoards of wealth. Yet the people followed Decebalus as if he were chosen by the wind itself. Here, in this place of sky and root, he prepared not just for war, but for memory. In the months following the first Roman campaign, the capital became both shield and shrine. Craftsmen from distant tribes were summoned. New fortifications were added, stones laid with care and intention. Messages were sent across the Carpathians, calling warriors, healers, and priests. Within the walls, there was no panic. There was rhythm. The Dacians understood cycles. They had watched stars vanish and return, and so they prepared. Each act was sacred. Blacksmiths forged not only weapons, but votive blades, meant to be broken as offerings before battle. The women of the villages dyed cloth with earth pigments, weaving patterns passed down through blood. Hunters brought food in quiet processions. Children were taught songs not of hate, but of remembrance. Sarmizegetusa was alive. It did not resist Rome out of rage. It endured Rome because it had always endured. Trajan, far to the south, understood the threat Sarmizegetusa posed, not just as a stronghold, but as an idea. Empires can burn cities. They cannot burn faith. And so, in his next campaign, the capital would become more than a target. It would become the heart Rome needed to pierce. But for now, the city remained untouched. The sanctuaries stood. The fire circles still glowed. The wolves still howled beyond the ridges, carrying omens through the trees. And Decebalus, quiet as ever, listened to them. He knew that what was coming could not be stopped, but it could be remembered. He walked each wall, each circle, each altar, memorizing them not as ruler, but as guardian. When he spoke with his people, he did not promise victory. He promised meaning, that even if the city fell, its spirit would not, that the stones, even if scattered, would one day whisper again. Sarmizegetusa Regia stood at the edge of time, part kingdom, part dream. It had no monuments that reached to the heavens. It was the heaven brought to earth. And as the wind picked up through the trees and the distant footsteps of legions echoed faintly across the valley, the city waited. Not with fear, but with knowing. The kind of knowing only mountains understand. That even when broken, what is rooted in truth cannot be lost. Before the eagle of Rome spread its wings again over the Carpathians, the Dacian warriors prepared in silence. Not for conquest, nor for glory, but for something more intimate, preservation. Of memory, of kinship, of land. Their shields were not painted for spectacle, but for lineage. Their swords, curved like the talons of hawks, were not raised in arrogance, but in defense of soil where their ancestors slept. They called themselves the children of the wolf. Their war banners bore the image of a beast whose jaws opened into the wind, whose tail was a serpent that danced with the breath of battle. When these dragon-headed standards were raised, the fabric caught the air and howled, a sound that chilled the blood of even the most disciplined legionary. It was not a war cry. It was an echo from older, deeper places. A call to the spirits of mountain and forest. The Dacians were not a standing army. They were farmers, hunters, herders, men who rose from the valley with the seasons. But when summoned, they moved with precision learned not from generals, but from generations. They knew their terrain intimately. They could vanish into forests where Roman formations collapsed into confusion. They struck like wolves, fast, silent, coordinated, and then gone before the dust could settle. Their weapons were not forged for show. The falx, the legendary sickle sword of the Dacians, curved in such a way that even a Roman shield could be pulled aside, the armor beneath pierced with devastating force. Some blades were so finely made that they seemed born from the rock itself. Others were chipped, worn, handed down through father and son, still strong with the memory of older battles. They did not march to drums or horns. They moved with the rhythm of rivers, with the rise of the hawk. Their battle formations were loose but intelligent, shaped by the mountain paths and the wooded ravines. Where a Roman commander might see chaos, the Dacians saw opportunity. The land was their ally, the forest their cloak. Even in retreat, they fought. Even in silence, they hunted. But theirs was not a war of hate. The Dacians knew that Rome, in its hunger, was not evil. It was simply blind. Blind to the texture of older worlds, to the value of a people who chose mystery over marble and firelight over fame. And so, even as they fought, the Dacians held to their rituals. Before each campaign, warriors would enter the sacred circles at Sarmizegetusa. There, the priests would mark their skin with ash and ochre, invoke the gods of the mountain and the flame, and offer them not domination, but remembrance. Some warriors fasted for days before battle, seeking visions beneath the pines. Others carried charms of animal teeth or carved stones, gifted by mothers, wives, or daughters, tiny worlds of love worn on leather cords across the heart. No Roman understood this. To the empire, they were barbarians. But to the Dacians, they were sons of the mountain, protectors of a silence older than stone. The tension grew as the Second Roman campaign approached. Decebalus sent messengers across the tribal lines, calling every able man to prepare. Though many had fallen in the first war, new faces arrived, boys now old enough to carry blades, old men returning to lift their weapons once more. And beside them, the women prepared as well, not to fight, but to tend the sacred fire, to whisper the names of the fallen into the forest, to remind the warriors what they were fighting for. There were victories still. Ambushes where Roman columns broke apart in narrow valleys. Raids on outposts where supplies were taken, prisoners freed. For every village Rome rebuilt, another Dacian path was carved deeper into the wild. But the enemy was changing too. Trajan had learned. He brought not only more men, but roads, engineers, siege equipment, discipline refined by defeat. Yet still, the Dacians fought. Not for empire, but for time. Time enough for the trees to record their names. Time for the mountains to hold the songs of their mothers. Time for the sacred places to leave their memory in stone, should the breath of the people be extinguished. Each warrior who fell did so not as a footnote in history, but as a whisper in the wind that would one day return, long after Rome itself had turned to dust. And in the shadows of the fir forests, where moss softened every step and ravens watched from high limbs, the Dacians remained, wild, quiet, waiting. For they knew the land in ways no invader could, and in that knowing, there was power, not the power to conquer, but the power to endure. Like wolves, like roots, like the deep pulse of a people too old to be forgotten. It was not built for empire, but for harmony. Sarmizegetusa stood high among the Oresti Mountains, not as a fortress of stone and mortar alone, but as a breathing center of knowledge, ritual, and power. The sacred capital of the Dacians was cradled by ridges and forests, veiled in mist and mystery, where sunrises lit the carved stones like glowing embers of an ancient fire. Its walls, made not only for protection but for sacred proportion, followed the rhythms of both the stars above and the hills beneath. There, Dacian priests walked between circular sanctuaries, casting shadows on altars aligned with solstices. Stones spoke to each other in silent geometry. Smoke curled from ritual hearths, and the murmur of water fed both the body and the spirit. But now, the Roman shadow grew longer across the land. Trajan's second campaign had begun with a different character. It was not the furious, lunging invasion of the past, but a methodical approach, like a tightening snare. The legions came with roads, with towers, with war machines that moved not like men, but like fate itself. Each conquered mile was secured. Every path forward was carved with the precision of a sculptor chipping at stone. The outer fortresses fell first. Dacian citadels perched like birds of prey on the cliffs, Castesti, Blitteru, Pietra Rosi, each holding as long as they could, sending messages of smoke and runners to the capital. They knew they were not final defenses, only delays. Sacrifices made to give the high heart of Dacia time to breathe, to prepare, to whisper its last songs into the mountain air. Sarmizegetusa watched with silence. The priests lit fires that had not gone out in centuries. In the great circular sanctuary, the sacred drums beat slower, as if time itself were thickening. Warriors gathered. Elders sat beside altars. The sacred fire, once a symbol of eternal order, now flickered like a candle in the breath of a storm. Then came the first smoke on the horizon. The trees below the Capitol trembled with footsteps, thousands upon thousands, Roman soldiers ascending with patience, not fury. Siege weapons rolled like giants up paths not made for wheels. Earthworks rose. Signals flashed in red and gold across distant ridges. Rome had come not to test, but to end. The defenders of Sarmizegetusa held not because they thought they would win, but because the place itself demanded it. The citadel was more than stone. It was a memory of the people, carved into the land. Each wall was a syllable of identity. Each gate was a threshold between the sacred and the broken. They fought like roots refusing to be torn from the soil. Decebalus, now older, now heavier with the weight of a dying kingdom, stood above the city, watching the approach. He no longer believed in victory, but he believed in meaning. And there, in that final defense, meaning became more important than survival. The siege unfolded slowly. Roman engineers severed aqueducts feeding the city. Thirst crept in before the blade. Supplies ran thin. Hunger softened muscle. But still, the city did not yield. Women hid children in mountain caves. Priests buried sacred scrolls deep beneath the sanctuaries. Warriors stood not in ranks, but in circles, backs to altars, eyes like flint. When the final breach came, it was not a battle, but a collapse. Fires rose not from Roman torches, but from within. Ritual burnings to keep the sanctity of sacred things, to prevent desecration. Altars were shattered by their own makers. Stone circles were broken, not by conquest, but by hands that had once built them. It was not surrender. It was silence chosen over humiliation. Sarmizegetusa did not fall. It was given back to the earth. What remained was not a ruin, but a tomb of meaning. Romans would walk among the blackened wood and broken stone and find no trophies, only echoes. The sacred city was gone, but its spirit, scorched into the mountain, would never fully vanish. As Trajan's banners waved over the ashes, the emperor believed the campaign had succeeded. The heart of Dacia had been taken. The wolf had been slain. But deep beneath the surface, in root and river and memory, the wolves were still watching. Their breath still curled through pine and mist. Their song still slept in stone. The fires of Sarmizegetusa had not yet cooled when the final act of Dacia's tragedy began to unfold, not on a battlefield, but in the silent folds of wilderness. Decebalus, the man who had once stood before emperors with dignity unbent, now moved through the shadows of his vanishing kingdom, pursued not by armies, but by the inevitability of history. He did not run with panic. He did not hide like prey. Rather, he moved with the stillness of a falling leaf, drifting not in fear, but in farewell. His companions were few now, loyal guards whose eyes no longer searched for victory, but for paths forgotten by the maps of Rome. The mountains that once sang to him in strength now whispered in mourning, their granite hearts heavy with the burden of what they had witnessed. Every valley he passed was one he had once known in youth, springs where he had drunk from cupped hands, stones carved with runes of older kings, forests that still remembered the rhythm of hoofbeats and drums. But now, the trails were lined with silence, and even the wolves, once heralds of his banner, howled with unfamiliar restraint. Rome hunted him like a shadow fleeing the light. Detachments fanned through the countryside. Rewards were offered. Allies turned to whispers. And yet, Decebalus remained always one turn ahead, not because he sought escape, but because he knew the end should be his to choose. He had fought too long to let his final breath be a spectacle beneath Roman steel. In a small clearing near the banks of the Sargetia River, where wild grasses bent in the wind like kneeling prayers, Decebalus made camp for the last time. The sun that evening was red, like the banners of the empire, but quieter. He sat beneath a twisted oak and laid down his sword, not in defeat, but in ritual. There was no ceremony, no crowd, only wind, and the hush of leaves remembering better days. Some say he spoke to the river before it happened, that he knelt at its edge, his hands in the current, as if returning something borrowed. Others say he carved symbols into a stone before drawing the dagger across his throat, a final defiance, an offering of blood that would not be taken by Roman hands. But no chronicler truly knows. Only that, when Roman horsemen found his body, it lay composed, as though sleep had finally come to a man who had not rested in years. They severed his head, as was the custom of victors. It was sent to Rome, carried through the streets in triumph. Crowds roared. Coins were struck. Statues rose in marble glory. But in Dacia, no roar was heard. Only the gentle hush of fog on the hills, and the soft echo of footsteps fading from the land. With Decebalus gone, resistance crumbled. Pockets of warriors melted into the forests, some to fight, some to vanish. The soul of Dacia, though wounded, lingered in unseen places. It lingered in the breath of wind over ruins, in the smoke of hearths rebuilt in silence, in the eyes of children who would grow up not knowing the old names, but still carrying the blood that remembered. Rome had conquered a land, but not a memory, not a silence, not a refusal. The last act of Decebalus was not surrender, but erasure on his own terms. In his death, he wrote a final sentence into the stone of his people. a sentence Rome could not translate, a whisper that would outlive the statues and the songs, carried not in marble, but in soil. Long after the emperor died and the empire began its slow unraveling, shepherds in the mountains still spoke of a king who chose silence over chains, a man whose voice now lived in thunder, whose presence stirred in fog. And though the world moved on, the clearing by the river remained untouched. No Roman monument marked it. No road was carved through it. Only the grass grew there, like memory. And somewhere beneath that ancient oak, where roots curl through centuries of forgotten soil, perhaps the earth still holds the breath of a king who, even in defeat, did not bow. After the hush of Decebalus' last breath faded into the wooded silence, Rome did what it had always done. It built. It built with stone, with roads, with columns that reached skyward as if to declare dominion not only over land but over time itself. Sarmizegetusa, once the spiritual spine of the Dacians, was swept clean of its charred embers, and upon its bones a new city rose. Colonia Ulpia Triana Augusta Dacica Sarmizegetusa, a name heavy with triumph, carved in Latin, as though to overwrite the pulse of the forest it replaced. Gone were the wooden sanctuaries where priests once marked the heavens and listened for the breath of wolves and stars. In their place came Roman forums, with statues of emperors gazing blankly over paved squares. Temples to Jupiter and Mars stood where the Dacians once buried sacred bones beneath the earth. Even the stones spoke a new tongue now, Greek and Latin etched into marble, while the old Dacian glyphs, curved like vines, sharp like spears, were left unspoken, unwritten, and slowly forgotten. To the Romans, this was order. To the Dacians who remained, those not slain, not enslaved, not fled into the mountains, it was a strange waking dream. They watched as their ancestral trails became military highways, as their rivers bore Roman bridges like iron teeth across the water's smile. Roman soldiers patrolled where druids once stood in quiet reverence. Markets buzzed where prayers had once fallen in whispers between the trees. The newcomers came with laws and lictors, with amphitheaters and aqueducts. Wine flowed, Latin was taught, commerce flourished. But beneath this polished surface, something older stirred, uneasy. The land had memory, and the memory was not Roman. Fields once nourished by sacrifice and song now bore grain under the empire's seal. But harvests do not forget the hands that first broke soil. Even in urban grandeur, the tension remained. Roman citizens, merchants, engineers, veterans granted land for loyalty, settled, and built lives. But the locals, now called Daco-Romans, lived in between worlds. Their speech blended tongues. Their gods were quietly honored in corners Rome did not notice. Their stories, if told, wore masks, myths painted in new colors, but carrying the same bones beneath. The empire considered Dacia a jewel of conquest, rich in gold, fertile in land, strategically placed. Mines were dug with Roman efficiency, pulling metal from mountain veins long worshipped by Dacian priests. Forts rose in grids, legion banners flapping over the wind-carved ridges. A new network of cities appeared, Apulum, Napoca, Poralisum, each one a Roman echo on Dacian soil. But the further Rome built upward, the more it lost sight of what lay below. Beneath every villa lay the outline of a hut, beneath every bathhouse the ghost of a hearth. The laughter of Roman children echoed over forgotten playgrounds. Columns cast shadows where Dacian kings once stood wrapped in wolfskin, watching the stars turn from mountaintops. Some Dacians adapted, others resisted quietly. A few walked into the forest and did not return, choosing the old ways, the old gods, the old breath of the land. In secret groves, fires still burned for Bendis, goddess of the moon and hunt. In household corners, totems carved from bone or wood waited beside Roman altars, silent but present. Rome was not cruel in every stroke. It brought roads that bound the territory. It brought medicine and new trades. But the cost was forgetting. And forgetfulness is a strange, slow poison. It does not burn or wound. It simply softens the edges of memory until names fade from lips and become dust. So Dacia became a province, written into the scrolls of governors and senators. But it was never truly Roman. Not in marrow, not in mist. The land wore the empire's mask, but beneath, the Dacian spirit endured, in stone foundations, in mountain winds, in the silence that refused to die. In time, even Rome would vanish. But what it had tried to erase, the pulse of the hills, the songs of the old tribes, the final breath of a king who chose death over chains, would wait. Wait beneath marble, beneath maps, beneath time. As decades unfolded and emperors came and went, Dacia began to slip from the heart of Rome's attention. The province, once celebrated in triumphal arches and gilded carvings, grew quieter in imperial memory. The gold that had once dazzled Trajan's dreams became harder to extract. The borders, etched proudly by conquest, began to bleed into the unknown once more. And from the mists of the Carpathians, the silence stirred. The forests reclaimed what they could. Vines curled around statues of Roman gods. Ivy climbed the walls of abandoned villas. Roads that had once carried soldiers and spices cracked under frost and disuse. Across the mountains and rivers, new peoples stirred, migrating, watching, pressing against the boundaries that Rome no longer guarded with the same resolve. Goths came first, like shadows testing the strength of doors. Then others followed, wave after wave, as if the earth itself was exhaling forgotten tribes. In the towns and fortified settlements, life continued in rhythm, but the rhythms changed. Latin remained the tongue of administration, but its purity faded. Dacian syllables crept back in, like moss under a locked gate. Roman customs softened, bending into forms more suited to mountain winters and forest rituals. The old gods were not spoken of loudly, but neither were they truly gone. People still paused at ancient wells, still touched the bark of sacred trees. Rome, facing pressures from all sides of its vast, unraveling empire, began to withdraw. Troops were pulled south across the Danube. Forts were abandoned. Governors were replaced by silence. No proclamation marked the moment Dacia ceased to be Roman. There was no fanfare, no ceremonial lowering of banners. It faded from the map the way breath fades from a mirror, sudden, inevitable, and eerily quiet. But the people remained. Not purely Dacian, not purely Roman. They were something new, yet deeply rooted, Daco-Roman, as history would later name them. They carried within their blood both the resistance of mountain warriors and the discipline of Roman roads. Their speech was neither the chant of old Dacian priests nor the perfect rhetoric of Latin scholars, but something in between, a language that remembered both forest and forum. In the absence of empire, smaller kingdoms rose and fell. Chaos became familiar. Fortunes shifted like snowdrifts. Christianity, once whispered under penalty of death, now took root in empty temples. Crosses replaced eagles. Saints' names replaced old incantations. But even then, deep beneath chapel floors, beneath foundations carved from earlier stones, older prayers lingered in the dust. Travelers spoke of strange places in the mountains, villages where ancient customs lived on in secret, where funerals followed moon cycles, and where names unrecorded by Roman scribes were still spoken beside firelight. These were not the Dacians of Decebalus' age, warriors cloaked in wolf skins, but something softer, older, enduring, like roots too deep to dig. Artifacts began to disappear into the soil. Dacian bracelets, Roman coins, fragments of statues, swallowed by time. The great cities crumbled, their names remembered only by shepherds and wandering monks. Forests grew tall again. Rivers flowed without bridges. And in that quiet, a question grew. Had the Dacians truly vanished, or had they simply become indistinct, absorbed into the fog, waiting for memory to turn its gaze back? Centuries would pass before that question was asked aloud again. For now, the lands once called Dacia rested. Not forgotten, not remembered, but breathing still, beneath layers of earth and language and lineage. A whisper inside the mountains. A flicker in the eyes of a child born near the ruins. A silence not of death, but of waiting. In the long night that followed Rome's retreat, the land that had once been Dacia became a tapestry of silence stitched with emberlight. Empires rose and fell beyond the Carpathians. Banners changed, and tongues shifted, but deep in the villages, beneath thatch and stone, the stories never stopped speaking. They did not speak in proclamations or carved inscriptions, but in lullabies, riddles, and winter songs. The Dacians, though no longer named, still walked in shadows and dreams. Children were told of heroes who spoke to wolves and vanished into mist. Old women, their backs bent like saplings, traced symbols on doorways that no priest had taught them. The rhythm of the land, the planting, the harvest, the gathering of herbs beneath certain moons, retained an order no longer Roman, yet older than the saints. Fireside tales wove together men and spirits, mountain gods and forest watchers. The names had changed, but the essence remained. In these folk tales, echoes of the Dacian soul survived, not in the form that scribes would recognize or that scholars could easily catalog, but as undercurrents in the stream of life. The Sarmizegetusa fortress was not remembered by name, but as the ruins where the thunder god once spoke. Decebalus became a spirit king, sometimes mourned, sometimes feared, sometimes mistaken for a wandering ghost in the mountain passes. Even in Christian rituals, something older stirred. Icons were adorned with herbs sacred to both saints and forgotten deities. Crosses were carved with motifs that reached beyond Bethlehem to some more distant, ancestral altar. The faithful crossed themselves before entering the forest, not just to ward off wolves, but to show respect to that which still lived, hidden in root and stone. And when storms rolled through the valleys, or strange dreams came with the winter, it was not unheard of for someone to mutter a name not found in the Bible. Names with sharp consonants and flowing vowels. Names that once belonged to kings who dared defy emperors. No one knew the full stories anymore. No one had written them down. But memory does not always need parchment. Sometimes it only needs breath. Monasteries preserved the light of Rome's learning, but the soul of the Dacians curled instead around shepherd fires and village wells. It lived in embroidery and gesture, in dance and silence, in the shape of a hill where a temple once stood, now called by another name. It lived in reluctance to speak of the past too clearly, as if saying it aloud might summon something too powerful to command. The Middle Ages passed in waves: Byzantines, Bulgars, Hungarians, Ottomans. Each brought their own weight, their own map lines, their own stories. Yet none could fully extinguish the roots beneath the ground. Because the Dacians were no longer a people, they were a presence, a layer of being, something remembered not through facts, but through feelings. And so, while the kings of Europe warred and bargained, and maps redrew themselves again and again, the Dacian spirit remained. It watched through the eyes of those who had never heard the word Dacia, but knew the curve of the hills like the back of their own hands. It lingered in the way people stood against storms, in the songs that mourned without words, in the quiet pride of those who had little, but still carried themselves like descendants of warriors. Centuries had passed since the last Dacian spear was lifted, yet under the right sky, with the right wind, one might still feel them near, not as ghosts, but as a breath held deep within the earth, waiting for the time when someone would listen. Not just with their ears, but with their memory. Centuries passed. Empires faded like distant echoes, and the world turned toward modernity, toward iron and steam, toward books and borders. The people of the Carpathians, by then Romanians, stood at the crossroads of empires, shaped by layers of conquest, faith, and resilience. But something deeper stirred beneath the visible layers of culture and law. A question older than politics whispered in the minds of poets and thinkers. Who were we, before we were told who we are? In the 19th century, as the fires of nationalism swept through Europe, nations began to look backward to move forward. In France, Rome. In Germany, the Teutons. In Greece, the glory of Athens. And in Romania, a flicker of something more ancient began to glow, a longing not just to resist, but to remember. Scholars dug into the past, not only to uncover it, but to shape it. Beneath the Latin tongue and the Orthodox cross, there was a silence waiting to be named. It was Dacia. Archaeologists returned to the ruins of Sarmizegetusa and found not just stones, but symbols, tools, fortifications, gold bracelets shaped like serpents, all etched with patterns that defied Roman categorization. Here were people who had not simply vanished. They had left marks, waiting for eyes that knew how to see. Excavations became declarations. Each artifact was a whisper pulled from centuries of soil. We were here. We mattered. Writers, inspired by this awakening, began to weave the Dacians into national identity. Decebalus, once a forgotten king in Roman accounts, became a hero of resistance. Statues rose. Poems sang of mountains and wolves, of gods in the mist, of the blood that had refused to kneel. History, for many, became a tool not just to understand, but to elevate, a banner beneath which a fragmented people could unite. But beneath the pride lay ambiguity. The Dacians had no surviving language, no preserved scriptures. What they left behind were fragments, bone, bronze, and mystery. Much of what was known was stitched together with imagination and intention. Were the Romanians truly their heirs by blood, or simply the spiritual descendants of a land that remembers more than it says? The truth was slippery, but the meaning was clear. The Dacians became a mirror. In them, the Romanian people could see strength, ancientness, resilience, qualities they longed to believe were always there. In the 20th century, the Dacians were elevated further, not just by scholars and poets, but by politicians. Under Ceausescu's regime, the past became political myth. Monuments were raised, television specials dramatized Dacian glory, and Decebalus was cast as a nationalist icon, standing defiantly against foreign influence. Yet the more the image was sharpened, the more it drifted from the earth it came from. The Dacians had become symbols, flexible, powerful, and increasingly distant from their true lives in the misty hills. Still, there is power in symbols, even imperfect ones. Across the land, children were taught about their ancient forebears. Museums filled with Dacian gold and helmets. A mountain face was carved into the likeness of Decebalus, as if the earth itself wished to remember. What had been erased was being rewritten, part fact, part yearning, part necessary myth. The past, though murky, became a source of identity, even comfort. And yet, amid all this remembering, there remains a hush. The real Dacians, the shepherds and dreamers, the women who spoke to stars, the artisans who etched mystery into silver, still lie just out of reach. Their silence resists capture. Their truth, deeper than politics or pride, still waits beneath the forest floor and in the pause between drumbeats. To claim them is one thing. To hear them is another. Still, the effort to listen continues. In every stone lifted from the soil, in every reconstructed village, in every hesitant line of a history book, the Dacians flicker again, no longer fully lost, but never fully known. And maybe that is how they were always meant to live, not in certainty, but in wonder. They are gone, and yet they are everywhere. Not in the bustling streets of Bucharest or the codes of modern law, but in the folds of mountains, in children's names, in the quiet gaze of artists who do not know why they draw wolves and spirals and flame. The Dacians, though stripped of voice, seem to linger where language fails, inhabiting not facts but feelings, not monuments but memory. In studios lit by late afternoon light, painters brush silhouettes of bare-chested warriors beneath crescent moons. They do not copy Roman records. They do not seek approval from textbooks. They are chasing a spirit, something between mist and metal, wild and still breathing. In music, too, echoes arise, minor scales, haunting flutes, rhythms that move like wind through forest pines. These are not Dacian songs, not really, but they carry a weight, an ache, a memory not one's own. The fascination is not only national. Across Europe and beyond, there is growing reverence for what was lost, not merely the Dacians, but all the peoples who stood before the age of records. In an age of noise and rush, there is something calming about silence, about old stones no longer explained. For the Dacians, whose mystery was sharpened by Roman fire, whose altars were buried and names erased, their return in the minds of dreamers feels less like resurrection and more like release. Writers fill pages with stories of kings and priestesses, of sacred wolves and forbidden forests. The Dacian world becomes canvas and clay, not because it is known, but because it invites imagining. A bridge appears, invisible but firm, from the mythic past to the hungry present. Through this bridge walks the idea that not everything must be recorded to matter, that some truths are preserved better in stories than in stone. There is a resurgence, too, of spiritual longing. In old valleys where sanctuaries once stood, new pilgrims gather, not to worship the old gods, but to feel the old awe. They walk barefoot on sacred ground, drink from mountain springs, whisper to trees. They do not wear togas or chant in reconstructed languages, but they carry with them the same questions. What lived here before us? And what part of it lives still? Reenactors wear handmade tunics and hammer bronze in open fields. Festivals bloom like remembered dreams, where Decebalus rides again, and children chase each other with wooden swords beneath flags bearing dragon-headed standards. It is theater, yes. It is nostalgia, but it is also reclamation, a quiet defiance against forgetting, a way of saying, this, too, was real. This mattered. In universities, young historians approach the Dacians with cautious reverence. They know what little is known and how much was lost. They write dissertations not to prove, but to ask. They trace lines through pottery and coin, through ruined watchtowers and ancient trade routes, mapping not just what happened, but how it might have felt. The Dacians become less a puzzle and more a presence, quiet, enduring, incomplete. In the modern Romanian soul, the Dacians are not only past, they are potential. They represent a time before division, before foreign rule, before the self was fragmented by empire and expectation. They are not perfect ancestors, nor fully understood, but in their absence, they have become a symbol of something pure, resistance without bitterness, mystery without fear, origin without ownership. And so, they live, in shadows and dreams, in the curve of a blade-shaped cloud, in the lull between thunder and wind. The world may move faster now, stones may crumble, but as long as there are hearts that yearn, the Dacians will be found, not only in history books, but in the silence that follows the telling of their name. Long after the Roman legions withdrew, long after the statues of emperors fell to ruin, the soil of the Carpathians continued to breathe. Beneath wild meadows and high ridges, traces of the Dacians remained, not in towering palaces or grand inscriptions, but in the quiet resistance of earth that refused to forget. No vaults of marble, no imperial echoes, only the hush of moss-covered stones, the lingering scent of pine and iron. Archaeologists still dig with trembling care, as if disturbing a sleeping breath. What they find is not always magnificent. A curved blade dulled by time, a burnt seed from a winter fire, a circle of post holes where once a dwelling stood. Yet each fragment carries weight, as if holding not just shape, but presence. It is not grandeur that defines the Dacians, but their persistence, not in politics, but in the land itself. What the Romans could not erase, nature gently covered. Forests crept over ruins, rivers whispered new paths over forgotten roads. But those places, once sacred, never became empty. Shepherds still pause where temples once stood, sensing without knowing. A spring still flows where a high priest once knelt. These are not memories stored in mind, but imprints passed down through footsteps, through wind, through something older than words. Even the language, though transformed, carries echoes. In certain dialects, words persist that no Latin root can explain. Names of rivers, hills, birds, they hold syllables that hum with ancient cadence. Scholars argue their origin. Locals simply say, it has always been called that. Perhaps that, too, is memory, not the facts we recite, but the names we never change. There are caves in the Apusini Mountains where paintings once told of gods and beasts. Though the pigments faded, the chambers still resonate. When one stands alone in those darkened vaults, beneath dripping stone, a hush falls that feels older than sound. It is as if the air remembers the chants once sung there, the hopes whispered before battles, the farewells spoken when none returned. It was never just the Roman sword that ended Dacia. It was time. It was forgetting. And yet, there is a deeper truth. Forgetting is never total. Beneath the stories of conquest lie layers of silence that still speak, if one listens slowly enough. The Dacians left little that could be measured, but they left behind something harder to trace, an undercurrent, a spiritual tone, a quiet refusal to vanish completely. For in every generation, there have been those who looked backward, not to glorify, but to remember, not to resurrect, but to reconnect. A farmer who follows the old planting rhythms. A woman who wears a symbol etched with unknown meaning. A child who carves spirals into wood with no reason, only instinct. These are not traditions written in law. They are transmissions of the soul. And perhaps that is how the Dacians endure, not in statues raised by kings, but in gestures passed between quiet lives. Not in the triumph of empire, but in the humble, breathing spaces empire always overlooks. In this way, the story of the Dacians is not over. It was never a conclusion, only a burial. And under each burial lies the seed of return, not in power, but in memory, not in conquest, but in continuity. As dusk falls over the hills they once called home, and the moon rises above ancient watchtowers now claimed by ivy, one thing remains clear. The Dacians are not waiting to be rediscovered. They are already here, beneath the soil, beneath the silence, and within those who still feel their pull without knowing why. Echoes that refuse to fade. In the vast canvas of history, many names rise and vanish, kingdoms drawn in ink that time eventually smudges away. Yet some stories, though muted, continue to hum beneath the surface, like a low drumbeat under layers of dust. The Dacians were not the most powerful, nor the most enduring. Their cities crumbled, their gods fell silent, their scripts dissolved into mystery. And still, they are not gone. Their presence is not carved in marble, but woven into the hillsides and whispered through the trees of Romania. It moves quietly, like mist rising from ancient valleys at dawn. It lingers in the cadence of language, in the spiral etched on a village gate, in the songs sung without knowing their origin. This is not remembrance. It is continuity, hidden beneath the rhythm of modern life. To walk where they once stood is to feel a kind of nearness. Not a ghost, but a hum beneath your feet, a presence in the quiet. History often rewards the loud, the written, the victorious. But there is a quieter strength in those who leave behind little, yet are never truly lost. The Dacians did not fade because they failed. They became something deeper, something that does not need to be seen to be real. So let this be a gentle reminder. Not all legacies are built with stone. Some are carried in silence. Some are rooted in soil. And some, like the Dacians, live on in the breath of forests, in the curve of mountains, and in the quiet knowing that something ancient still watches from the edge of memory. Let the silence hold them now. Let the earth remember what the empires forgot. Let the story rest, not ended, but returned.